In the Analysis Services Fundamentals course, I point out the different options we have for processing cubes and dimensions. In this module, I'll explain some common processing strategies. And to keep things simple, I'll just assume that you have a single database with a single cube in it. Of course, when we first deploy a database, it's in an unprocessed state, and so it's empty. We need to do a full process to load the dimensions and cube partitions with data. On an ongoing basis, if the time required to do a full database process is small enough, we can just choose to always do a full database process on a nightly basis or whatever frequency is suitable. We can just schedule it as a SQL Server agent job or include it as an analysis services processing task in an integration services package. However, for large cubes that take a longer time to process, we might need to implement other strategies. Each time we do a full process, the existing contents are emptied out and the data is completely reloaded in both the dimensions and cube partitions. We can do a full process at the database level, or for specific dimensions, or in cubes. Now, if we do a full process on a dimension, then we must do a full process on the associated cube. If the cube or dimension is large, and large for a dimension would be a dimension with millions of members, we can replace the full process with process data and process index operations. By splitting up these two operations that are part of process full, we can allow analysis services to focus resources on one operation at a time and sometimes get better performance that way. But remember, this is more of an impact when we're working with large data volumes. Now let's consider dimensions by themselves. For dimensions where we know we either have just new members or members that have changed, we can run a process update, and that loads in any new dimension members and makes changes to existing dimension members. Performing a process update does not require us to do a full process on the cube like we need to do when we do a full process on a dimension. The reason is that there are internal identifiers on the dimensions that are used when storing data in cube partitions. When we do a full process of a dimension, even when we're loading in the same data, there's no guarantee that each dimension member gets the same internal identifier. So as a result, the cube gets invalidated. With a process update, the identifiers stay the same. The only potential problem we have is that if we move a member from one parent in a hierarchy to another parent, and we're using flexible attribute relationships, then any aggregations for that hierarchy are invalidated. So we can run a process default on the cube to recreate those aggregations. Now, if the dimension data that we've already loaded doesn't change, and we only have new dimension members to add periodically, then we can use the process add option to insert the new records. It's going to run faster than a process update, and it does not have any impact on the cube. That means we won't have to rebuild aggregations or process the cube at all, if all we need to do is add new dimension members. On the other hand, process add requires some additional configuration steps. It's not particularly straightforward. On the resources slide for this module, I've included a link to more information about working with the process add option, and the Integration Services Fundamentals course includes an example of working with process add for dimensions. Now let's consider our options for processing partitions. If we have Enterprise Edition, we can limit the time necessary for processing by loading our new data into its own partition and then doing a full process on the current partition. This does empty out data and reload it, as well as rebuild aggregations. And if we manage partitions correctly, this should be a relatively fast process and much more efficient than processing all partitions. And of course, existing partitions remain unchanged and available. Now, if we're using Standard Edition, we can only maintain one partition per measure group, but we can achieve results much like partitioning by using process add to insert the new fact rows into an existing partition. Incidentally, this shows up as process incremental when you're using the graphical interface to configure processing. This is likely to run much faster than doing a full process on the partition. However, it's important not to let this become the only form of processing we perform because some fragmentation can occur when we do this often. So we might run the process add nightly and then weekly or monthly run a full process. Now, aggregations get updated when we do the process add, so there's no need to run a separate process afterwards.